Nietzsche uses the word nihilism in a precise and technical sense, and it is crucial not to confuse it with depression, sadness, or pessimism. Nihilism is not primarily a feeling. It is a condition of value, a situation in which the highest values that once gave life meaning no longer command belief. A person can be energetic, productive, and outwardly successful while living in a nihilistic condition. Likewise, a person can feel despair without being nihilistic. Nietzsche's concern is not emotional suffering, but the collapse of binding meaning. Nihilism occurs when people continue to live, act, and judge, but no longer feel that their actions are grounded in anything ultimately justified. Values still exist, but they feel hollow. Rules are followed, but conviction has thinned. Life proceeds, but without a compelling why. This is why Nietzsche insists that nihilism is historically specific. It emerges only after long-standing value systems, especially religious and moral ones, begin to lose credibility. Nihilism is not ancient despair. It is the aftermath of value exhaustion. Nietzsche is explicit. Nihilism arises not because people stop believing in values, but because they believe in them for too long under conditions that drain them of vitality. Life-denying values eventually undermine themselves. They preserve life while quietly emptying it of affirmative force. When those values collapse, the individual is left exposed. The habits of judgment remain, but their justification dissolves. One still asks what is right, meaningful, or worthwhile, but no answer carries authority. This produces a distinctive experience, not anguish but flatness, not revolt but drift. Life no longer feels tragic, it feels weightless. Nothing seems to demand commitment. Nothing feels worth sacrificing for. Nietzsche insists that this condition must not be moralized. Nihilism is not a failure of character. It is the logical outcome of a historical process. When values built on denial exhaust themselves, the void they leave cannot be avoided. Understanding nihilism correctly is essential because it determines how one responds to it. If nihilism is mistaken for depression, the response will be consolation. If it is mistaken for pessimism, the response will be optimism. Both miss the point. Nihilism is a structural crisis. It signals that the old ways of valuing can no longer organize life. The problem is not that nothing has meaning, but that meaning no longer arrives automatically. This is why Nietzsche treats nihilism as a threshold rather than a conclusion. It marks the point where inherited values lose their power, and the question of how values arise at all becomes unavoidable. Nietzsche insists that nihilism does not arrive suddenly. It emerges slowly, as the long-term consequence of values that deny life while claiming to protect it. Nihilism is not the opposite of morality. It is the after-effect of a moral system that has exhausted its own credibility. Life-denying values taught people how to endure suffering by interpreting it as meaningful. They restrained desire, disciplined instinct, and narrowed the range of what could be affirmed. For a long time this worked. Life continued, order was maintained, meaning felt secure. But these values came at a cost. By treating life as something that must be justified, restrained, or corrected before it could be accepted, they gradually undermined confidence in life itself. Vitality was treated as suspect. Affirmation was postponed indefinitely. Over time, this produces a subtle inversion. The values that once gave meaning begin to feel hollow. They still demand obedience, but they no longer inspire belief. People continue to act as if the values are binding, even as their emotional force drains away. This is why Nietzsche says that values often outlive faith in them. Practices persist. Moral language survives. Institutions remain. But the inner conviction that once animated them weakens. Life is still organized, but it no longer feels grounded. Nihilism emerges in this gap between habit and belief. The individual senses that the old interpretations no longer convince, yet cannot simply abandon them. Nothing new has taken their place. Meaning collapses gradually, not dramatically. This process explains why nihilism often appears as confusion rather than rebellion. People do not immediately reject values. They comply with them mechanically. Life becomes procedural. Obligation remains, but significance fades. Nietzsche emphasizes that nihilism is therefore not caused by disbelief alone. It is caused by overbelief, by centuries of commitment to values that denied life in order to preserve it. When these values finally exhaust themselves, the collapse is inevitable. Life denial prepared the ground for nihilism by training individuals to distrust affirmation. When denial fails, there is nothing left to fall back on. The protective structure dissolves, revealing the emptiness it had been concealing. Nihilism is thus not a sudden loss, but a reckoning. It reveals what has been missing all along, a way of valuing that affirms life without needing to apologize for it. Understanding this sequence is essential. Nihilism is not a mistake to be corrected. It is the unavoidable consequence of life denial reaching its limit. Nietzsche is careful to describe nihilism not as a dramatic emotional collapse, but as a flattening of experience. Nihilism rarely feels like despair. More often it feels like nothing in particular. Life continues, but without weight, urgency, or direction. This is why nihilism is so easily misunderstood. There may be no visible crisis. People still work, socialize, and pursue goals. Yet beneath this activity lies a sense that none of it truly matters. Motivation persists, but commitment weakens. Action becomes habitual rather than meaningful. Nietzsche emphasizes that nihilism feels empty, not tragic. Tragedy still presupposes values. Tragedy hurts because something precious has been lost. Nihilism hurts less sharply but more deeply because nothing feels precious enough to lose. This produces a condition Nietzsche associates with drift. The individual moves from one aim to another without genuine attachment. Goals are adopted temporarily, then discarded. Life feels like a sequence of distractions rather than a coherent direction. In this state, energy does not disappear, but it becomes diffuse. There is activity without orientation. People remain busy, yet inwardly disengaged. The question, why, no longer demands an answer, it simply fades. Nietzsche sees this as especially dangerous because it is comfortable. There is no immediate pain forcing confrontation. Nihilism can coexist with relative ease, entertainment, and security. Its danger lies in its quietness. The emotional tone of nihilism is therefore not anguish but indifference, not rebellion but fatigue. Life feels manageable but thin. Nothing demands sacrifice. Nothing calls for risk. This is why Nietzsche rejects the idea that nihilism will announce itself dramatically. It arrives disguised as normality. The world continues, but meaning no longer exerts pressure. Understanding this experiential dimension is crucial. If nihilism were experienced primarily as despair, it would provoke resistance. But because it often feels like flatness, it can persist indefinitely. Nietzsche's concern is not that people suffer under nihilism, but that they settle into it. Drift replaces engagement. Comfort replaces aspiration. Life is no longer denied aggressively. It is quietly emptied. This experiential emptiness sets the stage for the two major responses Nietzsche identifies next, one passive, one active, both attempts to cope with a world in which values no longer bind. Nietzsche describes passive nihilism as the most common response to the collapse of meaning. It is not violent, dramatic, or revolutionary. It is characterized by withdrawal, by a gradual shrinking of ambition, risk, and desire in order to make life manageable again. When values no longer bind, the individual seeks stability elsewhere, not in new ideals, but in comfort, safety, and minimization. Life is reorganized around avoiding disturbance rather than pursuing possibility. The question is no longer what is worth striving for, but what is least likely to hurt. Passive nihilism does not reject life outright. It lowers its expectations. Instead of confronting the absence of meaning, it adapts by reducing the scope of what life is allowed to demand. Desire is scaled down, aspiration is tempered, risk is treated as unnecessary. Nietzsche sees this as a form of exhaustion rather than defeat. After centuries of restraint and denial, vitality has been drained. What remains is a desire for calm. The individual wants relief from pressure, not a new challenge. This is why passive nihilism often presents itself as reasonable and mature. Ambition looks naive. Intensity looks irresponsible. Serious commitment feels excessive. Moderation becomes the highest value, not as balance, but as avoidance. Nietzsche is especially critical of how passive nihilism equates peace with health. A life free of conflict may feel stable, but stability alone is not vitality. The absence of pain is mistaken for fulfillment. In this condition, endurance becomes the goal rather than a means. One seeks to get through life with minimal disruption. The future is no longer a space of possibility, but something to be navigated carefully. What makes passive nihilism dangerous is not that it causes suffering, but that it neutralizes life. There is no revolt, no collapse, no crisis demanding resolution. Life continues, but without intensity. Nietzsche does not moralize this response. Passive nihilism is understandable. It is what happens when life-denying values collapse and no new strength has yet emerged. Withdrawal is safer than exposure, but safety has a cost. By minimizing life, the individual also minimizes the possibility of renewal. Passive nihilism preserves existence at the expense of becoming. This response explains why nihilism can persist quietly for long periods. Nothing forces a change, nothing breaks. Life simply becomes smaller. This shrinking prepares the ground for a very different response, one that rejects minimization and seeks intensity instead, even if that intensity takes a destructive form. Where passive nihilism withdraws, active nihilism attacks. Nietzsche describes active nihilism as a response to the collapse of meaning that seeks intensity through negation. Instead of minimizing life, it attempts to feel alive again by tearing down what remains. Active nihilism does not arise from strength, but from frustrated vitality. The old values no longer convince, but the energy they once suppressed has not disappeared. With no affirmative outlet, that energy turns destructive. This is why active nihilism often feels exhilarating. Destruction provides clarity. Tearing down values restores a sense of power. Negation feels decisive in a world where nothing seems to matter. Nietzsche is careful here. Active nihilism is not yet creation. It does not generate new values. It defines itself entirely in opposition to what it rejects. Its energy is real, but reactive. This is why Nietzsche refuses to treat active nihilism as liberation. While it appears bold, it remains dependent on the values it negates. Without something to destroy, it has no direction. Active nihilism often mistakes intensity for strength. Destruction produces movement, but movement alone is not creation. Without affirmation, destruction becomes an end in itself. Nietzsche also notes that active nihilism can easily slide into cruelty. When meaning collapses, moral restraints weaken. If nothing is worth affirming, nothing appears worth protecting. Destruction no longer feels justified or unjustified. It simply feels necessary. Yet Nietzsche does not dismiss active nihilism entirely. It plays a transitional role. By accelerating the collapse of exhausted values, it clears ground more decisively than passive withdrawal ever could. The danger lies in mistaking this clearing for completion. Without the emergence of new values, destruction exhausts itself. What begins as rebellion risks hardening into cynicism. Active nihilism therefore marks a moment of violent clarity in the nihilistic process. It exposes the emptiness of inherited values by refusing to preserve them gently, but it cannot sustain itself. Destruction without creation leads only to further emptiness. This is why Nietzsche treats active nihilism as a phase, not a destination. It burns away illusions, but it does not yet affirm life. Nietzsche insists that nihilism, however destabilizing, is not the final condition of human life. It is a passage, a necessary clearing that follows the collapse of exhausted values. Nihilism marks the moment when inherited meanings can no longer organize existence, but it does not determine what must come next. This is why Nietzsche treats nihilism diagnostically rather than tragically. Nihilism reveals something essential. The old values did not collapse because life failed, but because those values could no longer justify life convincingly. Their disappearance exposes a deeper problem, the absence of genuinely life-affirming values. Nihilism therefore performs a function. It strips away illusions. It removes moral structures that no longer carry conviction. It exposes the gap between habit and belief that denial had concealed. In doing so, it creates a space where something new might emerge. Nietzsche is careful not to romanticize this space. Nihilism is dangerous. Without meaning, life can drift, harden, or turn destructive. But danger is not the same as finality. Collapse creates vulnerability, and vulnerability makes transformation possible. What distinguishes nihilism from earlier life denial is that it no longer claims authority. The old moral voice falls silent. Commands lose their force. This silence is unsettling, but it is also freeing. For the first time, values are no longer imposed by tradition or exhaustion. This is why Nietzsche rejects attempts to rush past nihilism. To prematurely restore meaning through optimism, moral reassurance, or borrowed ideals would simply reinstall denial under a new name. The clearing must be endured. Nihilism is therefore not a failure of life, but a failure of inherited values. Life remains, energy remains. What is missing is orientation. This absence is the precondition for value creation. Nietzsche's claim is stark. Only when meaning is no longer guaranteed can meaning be created. Nihilism is the moment when this possibility first becomes visible. This does not mean that everyone will move beyond nihilism. Many will remain in passive withdrawal or destructive revolt. But nihilism itself does not close the future. It opens it at a cost. Understanding nihilism as a transition rather than an endpoint prevents despair and prevents premature resolution. It clarifies why Nietzsche does not stop here and why his philosophy moves toward a new question altogether. Not what values should we follow, but how values come into being at all. Nietzsche makes a subtle but crucial distinction here. Morality collapses before meaning does. This explains why nihilism is so confusing to live through. The old moral rules lose authority, yet the demand for meaning remains fully intact. Moral systems are structured, codified, and enforceable. They can be obeyed mechanically. Meaning cannot. Meaning must be felt. When morality loses its credibility, people may continue to follow rules, habits, and social norms, but they no longer experience them as justified. This is why nihilism often appears alongside moral compliance. People still behave correctly, still judge right and wrong, still feel guilt, but without conviction. Obligation survives belief. The structure remains even as its foundation dissolves. Nietzsche sees guilt as especially persistent. Even when religious belief collapses, guilt often remains. The individual still feels accountable, still feels watched, still feels the pressure to justify themselves, but no longer knows to whom or for what. This persistence is not accidental. Morality trains reflexes. It embeds habits of self-surveillance and self-judgment deeply into the psyche. These habits do not vanish when belief fades. They linger as empty forms. Meaning, by contrast, is harder to eliminate. The need for meaning does not depend on any particular moral system. It is more fundamental. Even when morality collapses, the demand for significance remains unresolved. This is why nihilism does not feel like freedom. The rules are gone, but the hunger persists. The individual is released from command, but not from the need for orientation. Nietzsche argues that this mismatch produces a peculiar tension. People reject moral authority while continuing to experience moral pressure. They deny belief while retaining guilt. Life feels ungrounded but not liberated. This explains why moral debate intensifies under nihilistic conditions. Without shared conviction, judgment becomes louder. Rules are asserted more aggressively as their foundations weaken. Morality collapses first because it was built to regulate life under denial. Meaning collapses later because it is tied to life itself. The old moral answers fail, but the question they once answered does not disappear. This delayed collapse is what gives nihilism its lingering quality. Life continues in a half-lit state, guided by habits that no longer convince and driven by a need that no longer knows where to turn. Understanding this sequence clarifies why nihilism cannot be resolved by simply discarding morality. What collapses is not only a rule book, but a way of interpreting existence. Nietzsche treats the psychological danger of nihilism as more serious than its intellectual difficulty. The problem is not that people stop believing in values, but that they lose the capacity to commit to anything with depth or endurance. Under nihilistic conditions, judgment becomes provisional. Beliefs are held lightly. Convictions are worn ironically. Nothing feels worth full investment, because full investment risks disappointment in a world where meaning no longer guarantees itself. This produces a distinctive psychological posture, detachment. The individual observes rather than participates. Irony replaces seriousness. Distance feels safer than involvement. Life is managed, not inhabited. Nietzsche sees this detachment as corrosive. Commitment requires vulnerability. To commit is to risk being wrong, to risk loss, to risk caring too much. Nihilism encourages the opposite stance: minimal exposure, maximal flexibility. Over time, this posture drains energy. When nothing deserves full engagement, motivation thins. Projects begin and end without consequence. Relationships lose gravity. Life becomes a sequence of reversible choices. Cynicism often follows. Cynicism protects against disappointment by preemptively dismissing value claims. Nothing is taken seriously because seriousness itself feels naive. This stance can appear intelligent, but it is fundamentally defensive. Nietzsche is especially concerned with how nihilism erodes responsibility. Without values that bind, responsibility becomes negotiable. One can always step back, reinterpret, or disengage. Action loses weight. This does not produce chaos immediately. It produces drift. Life continues, but without direction or pressure. The danger lies not in collapse, but in stagnation. Nietzsche insists that this psychological condition is unsustainable in the long term. A life without commitment cannot generate strength. Energy disperses, direction fades. What remains is either withdrawal or destruction. This is why nihilism cannot be treated as a stable resting place. It undermines the conditions required for any form of renewal. Without commitment, creation is impossible. Understanding this psychological danger clarifies why Nietzsche does not linger in nihilism. Diagnosis must give way to movement. Something else must emerge, or life will continue to thin itself out. Nietzsche is explicit that nihilism cannot be overcome by optimism, reassurance, or positive reinterpretation. Any attempt to fix nihilism by insisting that things are ultimately fine misunderstands the nature of the problem. Optimism assumes that meaning is still available and simply needs to be reaffirmed. Nihilism arises precisely because inherited meanings have lost their credibility. To restate them in a brighter tone is not a solution. It is denial reintroduced under a gentler name. Nietzsche is deeply suspicious of consolatory philosophies at this point. When values no longer bind, telling people that life is meaningful anyway does not restore commitment. It produces irony, not belief. The individual hears reassurance but feels the gap beneath it. This is why Nietzsche treats optimism as a continuation of life denial. It attempts to protect the individual from discomfort rather than confronting the collapse honestly. Pain is softened, but the underlying emptiness remains untouched. Optimism also demands agreement. It pressures individuals to feel hope even when they cannot justify it. This creates a new form of moral obligation. One must not only live correctly, but feel correctly. This emotional demand reproduces the ascetic structure Nietzsche has been dismantling. Nietzsche insists that nihilism must be endured, not explained away. The absence of meaning cannot be patched over with attitude. Only by allowing the void to be fully experienced can the need for new values become genuine rather than inherited. This is why reassurance often backfires under nihilistic conditions. Instead of restoring meaning, it highlights its absence. The more meaning is asserted, the less convincing it feels. Optimism also misunderstands the role of suffering. It treats discomfort as something to be eliminated, rather than as a signal that old interpretations have failed. By numbing the pain, optimism delays transformation. Nietzsche's refusal of optimism is therefore not pessimism, it is discipline. He refuses false comfort because false comfort prolongs dependency on exhausted values. Nihilism cannot be solved emotionally. It cannot be reasoned away or soothed into submission. It marks a real historical and psychological rupture. Only something that creates value rather than reassures or consoles can move beyond it. Nietzsche's most difficult claim about nihilism is also his most important. Nihilism is destructive, but it is not merely destructive. When fully confronted, it clears the ground on which new values can emerge. As long as exhausted values continue to operate, even weakly, they block creation. They occupy the space where new interpretations might arise. Nihilism removes this blockage by stripping inherited values of their authority. Nothing remains sacred by default. This clearing is not comfortable. Without given meanings, life feels exposed. There is no longer a framework that tells people what matters. But this exposure is precisely what makes creation possible. Values can no longer be received, they must be generated. Nietzsche insists that this moment cannot be bypassed. Attempts to preserve fragments of the old order only prolong dependency. Creation requires a genuine break, not a cosmetic adjustment. What nihilism clears away is not value itself, but false necessity. It removes the illusion that values are given by God, reason, nature, or morality. Once these sources lose credibility, the question of value becomes unavoidable. Who creates value and how? This is why nihilism does not automatically lead to chaos. Chaos arises only when clearing is mistaken for completion. Nihilism is preparation, not fulfillment. It opens a space that must be filled creatively or not at all. Nietzsche emphasizes that new values cannot be discovered like facts. They are expressions of life's strength. They arise from interpretation, perspective, and force. Nihilism exposes this truth by removing every other explanation. In this sense, nihilism is honest. It refuses borrowed meaning. It demands that value justify itself through life rather than authority. This is why Nietzsche does not lament nihilism. He treats it as a necessary ordeal. Without it, humanity remains trapped in denial. With it, the possibility of affirmation reopens. The danger, again, is stagnation. If nothing new emerges, nihilism hardens into resignation or destruction. Clearing alone is insufficient. Creation must follow. This segment marks the turning point. From here on, Nietzsche's focus shifts decisively. The question is no longer why values collapsed, but what makes value creation possible at all. Nietzsche is often misread as a philosopher who celebrates nihilism or who wishes to dwell within it. In fact, he does the opposite. Having diagnosed nihilism with unusual precision, he refuses to remain there. Nihilism is a condition to be passed through, not a worldview to be adopted. For Nietzsche, lingering in nihilism would itself become another form of life denial. To settle into emptiness, irony, or perpetual negation is still to let exhaustion dictate one's orientation toward life. It preserves collapse instead of moving beyond it. This is why Nietzsche distinguishes between understanding nihilism and identifying with it. To understand nihilism is to see why old values have failed. To identify with it is to mistake the clearing for a destination. Nietzsche will not allow this confusion. He also rejects the temptation to aestheticize nihilism, to turn meaninglessness into a pose of sophistication or intellectual superiority. This too is reactive. It draws energy from negation rather than creation. It feeds on what it rejects. Nietzsche's refusal to linger is grounded in a deeper commitment. Life must move. Stagnation, even when intellectually justified, is a form of decay. Nihilism halts movement by suspending commitment without replacing it. This is why Nietzsche treats nihilism as a midpoint rather than an endpoint. The collapse of inherited values is necessary, but it cannot be the final word. Something must follow, not because nihilism is uncomfortable, but because life cannot remain suspended indefinitely. Nietzsche does not yet offer a solution in the form of new values. He does not prescribe meaning. What he insists on instead is momentum. The question must shift. Diagnosis must give way to a new problem. That problem is no longer about belief or disbelief. It is about capacity. If values are not given, then what enables life to create them? What gives certain interpretations force, durability, and authority? By refusing to linger in nihilism, Nietzsche signals that the center of gravity of his philosophy is moving again. The emphasis shifts from critique to genesis, from collapse to production. This refusal marks the end of nihilism as a topic and the beginning of a new investigation. The next question is unavoidable and unsettling. If values are not discovered but created, what in life has the power to create them? At this point in Nietzsche's analysis, nihilism has done its work. The inherited sources of value, God, morality, reason, tradition, no longer command belief. The clearing has occurred. What remains is not chaos, but a more unsettling realization. Values do not exist independently of life. This realization forces a shift in the question Nietzsche is asking. The problem is no longer which values are true, but how values come into being at all. If meaning is not discovered but produced, then something in life must be responsible for that production. Nietzsche names this capacity will to power. This does not mean a desire for domination in the crude political sense. It names a fundamental feature of life, the tendency to interpret, organize, expand, and impose form. Life does not merely endure, it interprets. It shapes the world according to its strength, perspective, and capacity. Nihilism makes this unavoidable. When no external authority remains, value creation can no longer be hidden behind metaphysics. What counts as meaningful must arise from the forces at work within life itself. This is why Nietzsche does not introduce will to power earlier. As long as denial and inherited values functioned, the creative role of life remained concealed. Nihilism strips away that concealment. It exposes interpretation as the source of value. The transition here is not comforting. Will to power does not promise harmony or reassurance. It promises conflict, difference, and hierarchy of strength. Some interpretations dominate because they have more force behind them. Others fade because they cannot sustain themselves. Nietzsche does not present this as a moral endorsement. He presents it as a description of how life operates once illusions fall away. Values endure when they express strength. They decay when they express exhaustion. This transition marks a decisive turn. Nietzsche is no longer primarily critiquing old values. He is preparing to explain how new values arise, why some interpretations shape cultures, and why others fail. Nihilism was the necessary clearing. Will to power is the attempt to understand what fills that cleared space, not with comfort, but with force, creation, and interpretation. With this shift, Nietzsche's philosophy moves beyond collapse and into genesis. The question now is no longer why meaning failed, but what gives meaning its power to exist at all.